one of the most famous paintings in the world by Leonardo da Vinci. Most of us, of course, know this as the Mona Lisa. It's also known as La Gioconda. Now, you might ask yourself, what does this have to do with grammar? Well, indulge me just for a moment, and let's follow along as we discuss this painting in maybe a little more detail. First off, let's talk about what do you see first? What do you notice first about the painting? Well, most of us would say that our eyes tend to be drawn towards the top. Obviously, since this is a portrait, we can see that Da Vinci certainly wanted us to pay more attention to that part of the painting. Part of it, of course, is the light source. Notice how the light seems to be very dramatic here on the particular skin of the Mona Lisa. And then, of course, it seems to be somewhat interrupted by the darker color of her clothing. And then our eye seems to be drawn once again down to her hands. But of course, is that all we see in the Mona Lisa? Let's ask ourselves, why exactly is it structured this way? And how is it that our eyes do tend to focus on those things first? Well, again, one is that sort of delicate light and dark balance that Da Vinci uses so expertly. But let's also talk about its composition. If you notice, the Mona Lisa seems to be kind of a collection of triangles. First, the top, when it comes to sort of that light source that we see. Of course, as we extend the lines down through her body, you notice it's also carrying the lines of that triangle. There also seems to be kind of a repetition of the triangular shape as we look at her hands as well. So in some ways, Da Vinci is using kind of a fairly geometric kind of design so that she is clearly in the center of the painting and seems to dominate most of it, but that she also seems to share some part of the painting with the background. Now, as we continue on and look a little more carefully, let's think about what else do we see? Well, as we move in and start to notice some of the little details, again, as we look at her hands, we see that same sort of delicate light that we saw with the face. But then notice over here in the particular detail of her clothing. Notice how the lines work. We can almost see, in a sense, and feel the fabric of the cloak that she's wearing. So again, Da Vinci was a particular expert at detail. But then notice some details tend to kind of fade into the background. Again, the light is helping to bring out those particular folds. Now, what's interesting as we continue on and look at other parts of the painting, something very interesting happens. If you will notice in the background, a part of the painting that we haven't even talked about yet, you will see that there seems to be, again, some sort of idea of repetition. First, we had the repetition of triangles. Then we have somewhat a very subtle repetition there in the background of some of the folds that we see in the Mona Lisa's clothing. Again, that type of repetition tends to bring a sort of consistency, even though the background is not necessarily drawing our eye at the beginning. Then, as we move up again, looking at the painting, notice in other ways how Da Vinci depicts something very interesting here. The Renaissance, of course, was a break, in a way, with the previous painting style. And one of the things we can see is that the background itself seems very realistic, very lifelike. In fact, the Mona Lisa seems very lifelike or realistic as well. But notice how the light and shadow in the background tends to make those items in the background kind of disappear. Well, this is exactly how our eyes function. When we see details from a distance, the detail tends to get less and less specific. And of course, we see that in other parts of the painting as well. Now, let's move back to her face, and of course, we can't forget perhaps the most important part of the Mona Lisa, and that's her smile. Or is it really a smile? You know, there have been many discussions and theories over the years as to why she's not exactly smiling with a wide, kind of wide smile, but we also notice that it's kind of mysterious. So we don't quite know maybe what the Mona Lisa is thinking. So as we step back for a moment and see the painting again, suddenly we start to realize there are other little details that we didn't notice at first. as we look even more carefully, we can notice there does seem to be some detail here over the right shoulder, what appears to be some sort of bridge. And again, we notice that subtle echo of the twisting sort of path that once again is repeated down here in her clothing. Now you might say, well, what's the point of all of this? And what in the world does this have to do with grammar? Well, the thing we're going to talk about in this video is how to see things that we don't often pay attention to. In other words, how to look at the entire painting and then be able to look at smaller details. And then finally look at the painting again, to look at the whole idea, and to start understanding how they all work together. That's really going to be our challenge here in this first video. Now, to review from our Intro to Grammar series, we talked about the fact that grammar is about understanding relationships. For example, we talked about that part of the idea is that words and ideas go in a certain place, in a certain order, and that sometimes those particular ideas are also determined by logic. Another key thing to keep in mind is that these particular relationships, since they do have a certain logic of their own, we have to be able to maintain the grammatical balance between these relationships. So we have to understand the rules that determine them. Now, our goal in this video is to understand that we have to develop the ability to switch back and forth between these different levels of relationship. So in our intro series, we talked a lot about how words work on a word level, and then slowly began to realize that these particular words had to go together. And we had to understand that these certain relationships work in different parts of the sentence. So in other words, our real goal here is to be able to see the details and the whole picture at the same time. Now, I believe that for us, in our discussion here of more advanced grammatical ideas, the problems really begin with identifying words that connect. So, in other words, we're going to focus on words that oftentimes we don't consider to be that important. You might recall that we referred to some of these ideas as minor parts of speech in our Intro to Grammar video series. But these particular ideas, prepositions and prepositional phrases, coordinating connectors, and conjunctive adverbs and correlative conjunctions, and something we're going to explore more in this video series, subordinating connectors, such as adjective, noun, and adverb clauses, are the particular things that we want to start learning how to see better. Our guiding question in this video is to think about where do these particular connections begin and where do they end. Let's start with prepositions. Now, as we mentioned in the intro series, there are too many prepositions here to mention, but some are in, on, at, to, for, around, during, of, and so on. Now let's look at this first set of sentences that I have here on the screen. Now, you might recall that prepositions themselves never appear by themselves. They usually go together with something else in the sentence. Well, for example, I'm going to go through and underline all the prepositions that we see in these sentences. So take a look. So at first we've identified the prepositions. But again, remember their ideas are to connect something. So the question is, what do they connect? Well, first off, we know that the prepositional phrase begins with the preposition. So I'm going to start by kind of beginning the left sort of parentheses here. So especially in the third sentence, you'll notice that we have three beginnings. So maybe the endings will be a little bit easier to spot. But let's go back to the first one for just a moment. So where does this particular prepositional phrase end? Well, generally we recognize that prepositional phrases end with a noun, or in this case more specifically, the object of the preposition. So in this case, the word headlights is where the idea ends. So we've identified a particular connection. Now, what are we connecting? Well, we're connecting the word car to the idea that it has no headlights. But in general, this is the beginning and ending of our connection. We have the word with, and it includes the idea headlights. And this is where the particular idea finishes. So again, as we mentioned at the top here, this is a prepositional phrase. Now, sometimes prepositional phrases are easier to spot if they begin the sentence. In this case, as you can see, we do have punctuation to help us. But again, that's not always going to be there to help. So we need to identify that the word window is the noun in this particular phrase, and this is where the prepositional phrase ends. In the final example, and this again happens often in English, you have more than one prepositional phrase after the other. So in this case, we can see that with these particular prepositional phrases, these are the beginnings and the ends. In each one of these examples, we have nouns, or the objects of the prepositions, to finish the idea. So, these little words, with and from and for, these are words that we often don't pay attention to because generally they don't contain a lot of meaning by themselves. But see, now we have to be able to see them and to recognize how are they functioning in these examples. So now we have to be able to see the whole sentence, but also to specifically zone in and find the smaller relationships. And again, I believe the best way to do that is to focus on the connectors. So in our first example here with prepositions, the prepositions are serving as the connecting ideas. Okay, let's move on to our next connection idea. And those are coordinating connectors. And the six or so that are certainly the most common and probably words that most students learn kind of at the beginning are especially and, but, and or. So, yet, and then of course perhaps less popularly for. So again, these are some examples of coordinating connectors. So the question is, what do they connect? Well, coordinating connectors in general do two things. They can connect words to each other. So for example, notice the word and here begins the idea. The question is, what are we connecting? Well, we're connecting the idea of cold milk to the idea of hot coffee. So in a way, the word and is really kind of helping connect the first idea to the next idea. So, in a sense, we're connecting two independent things. So and itself is the connector, but that cold milk and hot coffee will sort of be the beginning and end of the idea. So the word and is in the middle, but this is what it's actually doing. It's actually connecting two things that we consider to be of equal importance. So we like something, we like cold milk, we like hot coffee, so in a way we're connecting both of them. Now in the second idea, our information is much longer. In this case, we're connecting two independent ideas. So if you'll notice, I'm going to underline the part that we probably notice first, which are the two big clauses here. But it's the word but that's helping to connect both of them. So in a way, it's pretty difficult to determine where the connection begins because we're connecting two whole clauses and independent clauses as well. In fact, these could be separated almost into two separate sentences. So again, the key is to figure out, where does the idea begin? Well, again, you're connecting the word but the idea is connecting, really, two complete things. Because both contain separate subjects and separate verbs. Now, conjunctive adverbs, as you can see, several examples are listed here on the screen, and I have to thank the textbook, The Essentials of English, which is cited at the end of this video as the source for this information. But you notice there are many different kinds of conjunctive adverbs. Many of these words are probably words you're familiar with and have seen before, and certainly it would be a good idea to study those a little more in depth. But when we see them in actual examples, they're actually fairly easy to identify. Most of the time it's because they're helped by certain punctuation marks. For example, you notice there's a semicolon here and a comma here. So in a way, what we're connecting is much like we saw with the coordinating connectors, with and, but, and or. In this case, for example, and then it's connecting the independent clauses. Colors can have different meanings. And white, and connecting all the way to the word others. So the connector here, for example, tells us that the beginning of the idea is actually way back here, and that it's connecting this entire clause to the clause that follows it. And in fact, we can even kind of think about what is the relationship between these two clauses. Well, I see the words for example. So this clause, this second independent clause, is an example of the idea that's described in the sentence before it. In our second example, we see, again, the same punctuation. A semicolon here, a comma here. This is our connecting word. And again, what is it connecting? Well, the beginning of the connection actually starts here with one full clause and then connects to the independent clause that follows. And again, how do these words connect? Well, the word nevertheless is telling us what that connection is like. So if you notice, for example, my mom had a full-time job, that would lead us to think that she would not have time to cook dinner. But the connector is telling us that she still did it, even though she had a full-time job. And that connecting word, nevertheless, helps explain that the second part of the sentence is kind of a surprise. So again, it's just telling us that the beginning of the idea actually is quite far back. It's at the beginning of one clause, connecting us to the beginning of another clause. Our final type of coordinating connector is what's called a correlative connector. And basically, correlative means that these connectors come in pairs of two. So you'll notice, for example, both and, not only, but also. So these particular ideas we have to look for used together. And again, you can study these. Certainly be a good idea to learn them and to learn what they mean. In the examples we have here, the Italian film Life is Beautiful made me both and. So in this case, we notice that the word both, in this case, will begin the connection. It made us both do something and something else. So the end of that connection would be here. Of course, what is it connecting? Well, it's connecting us to this part of the sentence before it. So in this case, correlative connectors can connect words together within a sentence. It made me do something. In this case, two things. In the second example, we notice we're connecting phrases to each other. So first we identify whether and or as a pair or correlative connector. And then we notice that the beginning of the idea actually starts with a connector and ends with the word job, because it's helping us connect to something we can't decide. We can't decide whether to do this or to do this. Finally, in our example here at the bottom, again, our pair of neither and nor, these work together. And the idea that they're connecting is the fact that we are connecting two different subjects of the sentence. So in this case, my father will not meet me at the airport. My mother will not meet me at the airport. So here I've just combined the two and said that neither will meet me at the airport. So in this case, the connection begins here and ends at the end of mother. Now, probably the most confusing, in a sense, are subordinating connectors. And this is what we're going to talk more about in our next video. Some examples of adjective clause connectors are who, that, and which. Now notice though how these particular connections work. Sometimes these connections work inside of the main part of the sentence. Other times they work in front or after. For example, I noticed the word who. So in this case I'm thinking, well, this may be the beginning of the idea because it's connecting to who we're talking about. So we're not just talking about students, we're talking about students who have an A average. The question though is, where does the idea end? Does it end all the way at the end of the sentence? Well, if it does, then you'll notice that the only part of the sentence we have left is the word students. Now, this is something we're going to talk more about with subordinating connectors in the next video. In this case, subordinating connectors, or we also are referring to what are called dependent clauses. This is, again, an example of an adjective clause. These particular clauses work in a way with the main idea of the sentence. So in this case, the actual idea ends with the word average. So you see, the main idea of the sentence is students do not have to take the final exam. But this particular clause here is clarifying, well, which students exactly? So if we had to say that it begins with the word who and ends with the word average, then we have successfully identified the adjective clause in this sentence. And it all begins with the idea that it starts with the connector. Okay, look at this next example. As I read along, I see the word that. Now this one's kind of easy because we notice that this is going to be the beginning of the idea, but that as we follow along, we notice there's nothing else. There's just a question mark. So in a way, this is going to be the end of the idea. But again, notice what happens. It's not connecting things that are equal. In this case, it's helping to clarify which particular book we're talking about. So once again, this would be referred to as an adjective clause. And it all is identified by the connector itself. In our final example, we have some punctuation to help us, along with identifying the connecting word. But this one is nice because, again, it helps to separate this particular clause from the main clause that it's describing. So again, in the main idea, it's I'm afraid to take advanced calculus, but this one helps explain the calculus class itself. Not just any calculus class, but the calculus class that's required for my major. Okay, so as we move on to noun clauses, again, noun clauses use, in fact, if you notice, many of them use words that appear sort of like question words. But of course, these are certainly not all of the noun clause connectors that exist. But again, they do function as subordinating ideas. So we're going to treat them much like we treated the adjective clauses, in that we're going to find the connecting word. So as I read through the sentence, I notice there's that word what. So in a way, this will tell me that this is the beginning of the idea. Now the question is, where does it end? Well, once again, the question is to think about what is its function in the sentence. Well, world leaders have been meeting to discuss something. And that something is what action governments should take. So in this case, this would be the end of the idea. In this second example, this is a fairly common use of a noun clause, in which you have someone, what appears to be a question, and that someone is responding by including part of the question in the response. So for example, this question probably would be, why did he say that? And the person responds with, I don't know why he said that. So again, why begins the connection, the particular idea that's connecting, and that is the final part. Same thing in the final example here. The word what begins the idea, and in this case it continues all the way to the end of the sentence. So in these situations, these particular clauses are serving a similar function to a noun. So again, in the second example, I don't know something. Well, the something is why he said that. In the third example, it means I wonder something. And that example would be, I wonder what they're going to say. In our final example, with adverb clauses, there are way too many adverb clauses to mention in this video, but here are a few. And once again, the key is to look for the connector first. So as we do that, we notice the word if is here. And again, punctuation is there to help us. So in this case, we can separate out the adverb connector here. If it rains, comma. So we can separate this particular idea. But again, it begins with the adverb clause connector. Now the second example is a little tricky. This one uses a particular phrase called so something that. So for example, the music was so loud. So in this case, so begins the idea, so loud that we couldn't talk. So in this case, you'll notice that so loud is part of the idea. The music was something. But the actual beginning of the clause is here. That. Because it is modifying the word loud. In this next example, you notice we do have a coordinating conjunction here, and that's fine. But our eye seems to also be drawn to this big word here, because. Well, again, because helps introduce an adverb idea. So this is where our connection is going to begin. And fortunately, since it's at the end of the sentence, it's also going to end here. Finally, you can see that this one is another paired kind of situation, as close to the theater as we could. But in this case, we're actually going to begin the clause with the word as, and finish it, believe it or not, all the way at the end of the sentence. So again, this adverb explains the answer of where. Where did we park? We parked somewhere. We parked as close to the theater as we could get. So what did we learn in this video? Well, the key is to look for where do these natural connecting ideas begin and end. Well, with prepositional phrases, we notice they begin with the preposition itself and end wherever the noun or object of the preposition may be. Now, of course, could there be words in between the preposition and object? Of course. This only defines where the idea begins and where the idea ends. Now, with coordinating ideas, it was a lot more difficult because we noticed that the connections were being made to independent or almost complete ideas to each other. So in one common pattern, we noticed that the coordinating connector or the correlative connector was in some ways connecting an independent clause to another. I'm sorry, even a conjunctive connector. Of course, we also notice that these connectors can also at times connect words to each other. So, for example, Coke and Pepsi. I can neither swim nor hunt. Notice it was connecting swim or hunt together, and that would be considered sort of the beginning and end of the idea. This correlative connector had two words. This, but not that. So again, this is part of that connection as well. So this would be part of it, and then but not that would be the second part. So part of the idea is we have to understand what it's connecting. Finally, with subordinating connectors, the trick, of course, was that when we had an independent clause, well, those dependent clauses, those subordinating clauses like adjective, adverbs, and so on, could go at the beginning of the clause, could go at the end of the clause, or could even go somewhere in the middle of the clause. And of course, this is since this is a kind of typical, tricky grammatical idea, this is something we're going to explore more in our next video. So to wrap up, look for the connecting words first. Oftentimes students forget about that, but this is often where the problems begin. It's important to identify what type of connection it is. and determine if it's connecting only a small part of the sentence, which is what prepositions and some coordinating connectors do. Is it connecting a larger part of the sentence, which is mostly what subordinating connectors do? Or, as we noticed, are they coordinating ideas that connect two or more complete clauses together? That's where oftentimes students have trouble. By ignoring the connecting words, they oftentimes can't seem to understand the particular structure of the sentence they're looking at. So again, look for the connecting words first. In our next video, we will expand on the idea of seeing sentence patterns and go more in depth with subordinating connectors and the adjective, noun, and adverb clauses that they help to connect. Thanks for watching.